Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Jeffrey Bobeck. I'm with the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. Welcome to our webinar today entitled Direct Air Capture, a Guide to Private Sector Planning. I serve as Director of Policy Engagement for C2ES, which, as you may know, is an independent and nonpartisan organization that focuses on policy and action to address climate change. Our core mission is to forge practical solutions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, promote clean energy, and strengthen resilience to climate impacts. We have roughly 200 people registered for this webinar, so we know there's a lot of interest in this topic. Before we get into the content, I want to review a few housekeeping items. First of all, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our webinar at c2es.org. We'll hold most questions until the end, but please enter yours in the chat box at any time during the speakers. To do so, use the box in the GoToWebinar interface. I'll try to ask a few clarifying questions that come up during the presentations, but again, we'll save most of the big ones for the end. And given the large number on this webinar, we may not get to every question, but we will try to be sure to cover all the key issues that are raised by the audience. Let me talk a little bit about C2ES's interest in carbon capture. Carbon capture, utilization, and storage have become a very important issue in terms of climate mitigation in recent years, but it was not always so. In 2011, C2ES joined with the Great Plains Institute to form a coalition now known as the Carbon Capture Coalition, which at the time was laser focused on getting the 45Q credit for CO2 storage enacted. Well, it was enacted in 2018, and the guidance for that will be due out from the IRS later this year. And we do anticipate a flurry of activity on new projects of all types for carbon capture and storage. But the one aspect we want to focus on today is direct air capture, which, as most of you know, is capturing CO2 from the atmosphere. It's not very well understood, and that's probably why you've seen a lot of events and webinars. We want to take a particular look at it today from a business perspective. So we'll be touching on the technical aspects of this and the climate policy aspects. We really want to have a better understanding of what the business case is for direct air capture. We have experts today from the Rhodium Group, which published an influential study earlier this year, Carbon Engineering, which is one of 3 companies worldwide that is actually currently doing air capture, and finally, Oxy LowCarbon Ventures, the wholly owned subsidiary of Occidental Petroleum, again, a Fortune 500 company which is betting on direct air capture. So we think we'll get some good business sense out of that. Let me introduce these experts by name. First, we'll hear from the Rhodium Group's Whitney Herndon. Whitney is a senior analyst. Sorry, let me advance this. There we go. Whitney is a senior analyst at Rhodium Group, focused on U.S. energy markets and policy. She analyzes the impact of policy proposals on the U.S. electricity sector and energy markets. Most important to us, Whitney co-authored the Rhodium report entitled Leadership Policies for the U.S. to Advance Direct Air Capture Technology, which, as I said, was released in May. Then we'll hear from Lori Guetre from Carbon Engineering. Lori handles business development for the company, whose aim is commercializing direct air capture technology to deliver large-scale negative emissions. Lori brings more than 25 years of engineering and finance experience to Carbon Engineering's team, stemming from previous roles in technology and aerospace. And finally, William Swetra serves as strategy analyst at Oxy LowCarbon Ventures, the wholly owned subsidiary of Oxy Petroleum. William's been part of Oxy's government relations team since 2014 and previously served on Capitol Hill. In his role with LowCarbon Ventures, he focuses on carbon capture, utilization, and storage policy, carbon trading programs, and greenhouse gas mitigation issues. Let me say a word or two about carbon capture, utilization, and storage generally. It's recognized now by groups, international groups like the International Energy Agency, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it's considered that capturing greenhouse gas emissions can help provide the quickest path to reducing emissions, and it's the most important options for certain applications like addressing industrial emissions. This technology isn't much different for air capture, but the concentration of CO2 in the air, by definition, is lower than virtually all other sources of CO2. The level of concentration of CO2 in the source is a pretty good indicator of the difficulty of capture and hence the cost. For instance, methanol produces a pure stream of CO2, which doesn't require separation, while flue gas, for instance, technically speaking, is full of junk that must be separated. And air is around us is 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, but only 0.04% CO2. In other words, 400 parts per million. Now that's a number many climate people are familiar with. It's too high, but it's not high enough to make it easier economical to separate. So as I said, we'll touch on technology and climate policy, but we really want to focus on how direct air capture can happen commercially, because the one thing we have certainly found from our other experience with other types of carbon capture is that commercialization is the most important leading indicator of deployment. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Whitney Herndon, and let me start by asking her, Whitney, why are we even doing this?
Thanks, Jeff. So I'm going to give an introduction to why we are talking about direct air capture today and its importance in our overall future and deep decarbonization. So as I think probably most of you on the webinar know, for about the past millennia, carbon dioxide concentrations have been hovering between about 150 and 300 parts per million. Starting in the 1950s, that started to consistently escalate above 300 parts per million because of anthropogenic CO2. And that has obviously raised cause for concern on what the healthy level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is. Go ahead, next slide, Jeff. So we'll get to the emissions that we are kind of considered in the desirable range and the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere that we're shooting for. But the thing that we want to focus on in terms of the importance of direct air capture is this is a technology that can both mitigate CO2 emissions and remove historical emissions. So one of the things that people say is, why can't we just focus on not emitting CO2? And the reason for that is because 95% of our problem already exists in the atmosphere. And in order to bring CO2 down to healthy atmospheric levels, we really need to remove historical emissions in addition to mitigating going forward. Next slide, Jeff. So how much should we mitigate and how much should we reduce emissions? There's been several reports from the IPCC. The figures in this chart, or the figures in this slide, show on the left emissions pathways if we want to reach a 2 degrees Celsius temperature target. And then on the right is the latest IPCC emissions trajectories that have really brought into focus the need for carbon dioxide removal, including the need for technological carbon dioxide removal, which is the category that direct air capture falls into. So next slide, Jeff. We asked the question of how much direct air capture do we think we will actually need to meet these temperature targets? So we looked at, in our modeling, in the report that Jeff mentioned earlier, we looked at kind of two emissions reductions pathways, depending on how ambitious we want to be with emissions reductions. We looked at a 100% emissions reduction. These are all compared to 2005 levels. So a 100% reduction by 2045 and an 83% reduction in emissions by 2050. And we wanted to see, even if we push on all of our other mitigation levers, how much direct air capture do we think we'll need? So the bar on the left is our current emissions from 2016, most of which are coming from energy CO2. And in the scenario where we want to achieve 100% emission reductions by 2045, you can see that energy CO2 emissions are dramatically reduced. And in any scenario where we want to achieve 100% emissions reduction by 2045, we need a significant amount of direct air capture. And that is including, in those scenarios, that includes, all the other technologies that we typically think of that are necessary for a deeply decarbonized future. So that it includes bioenergy with CCS, it includes natural sequestration, it includes a nearly 100% zero carbon power sector. Electric vehicles are pushed to maximum deployment penetrations. Likewise, when we look at kind of those same parameters, but we look at only reducing emissions by 83% by 2050, which is still considered a deeply decarbonized future, we see that in the very best case scenario, including 100% of EV sales by 2050, 100% of the power sector decarbonized. In the best case scenario, we don't see any deployment of direct air capture, but when we are in another scenario where we have limited availability of bioenergy with CCS, where the cost of zero carbon electricity generation is higher, and we have less availability of natural sequestration, we see a large deployment of direct air capture. So the orange bars are our direct air capture, and what we see throughout our scenarios is somewhere in most of our scenarios on the order of 1 to 2 gigatons of direct air capture deployed for sequestration. Next slide, Jeff. So one of the things that we really want to focus on and drive home today is that direct air capture is a technology that is ready to go. It used to be, because of some older studies that were very theoretical, people thought that the cost of direct air capture were really high, somewhere on the order of $600 to $1,000 per ton. This past year, several studies, including our own, came out and looked at the cost of direct air capture. Carbon Engineering, who we're going to hear from today, published a great paper in Joule where they looked at the cost of direct air capture using all publicly or commercially available equipment and several third-party engineering sources. Then the National Academies of Science, they released a big report about this time last year that was looking at carbon dioxide removal in general, all the different technologies, and also natural means and their estimated costs. And then we looked at both of those papers and the ranges that were presented in those papers, and we distilled what we considered our own really realistic range for what the cost of the next, what we consider commercial scale plant, which is a plant of the size of 1 million metric tons. And we determined that we think those costs are in the realm of $124 to $325 per ton of CO2 removed from the atmosphere. And I think this was a big game changer for the optics of the industry overall, because it's really within the realm of the possible. It's not that when we think of a future where we're decarbonizing to net negative, to do that at $124 to $325 per ton seems really reasonable. And I'll get to how we think those costs will change over time. But again, that's just for what we perceive to be the cost of the next first commercial scale plant. So the industry today has three major players: Carbon Engineering, who we'll hear from, and then we have Climeworks. They're located in Zurich, Switzerland, and Global Thermostat, which is located here in the US. There's a couple different technologies that Lori is going to talk about when she gets to her slides. There are several plants deployed globally, and we, due to some of the tax incentives here in the US, being the 45Q tax credit and the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, I think we're on the verge of seeing our first major commercial scale plant here. And again, Lori and William are going to talk about that some more. So, and then in addition, these companies are attracting a lot of private investment. Next slide, Jeff. So one of the things that we focus on in our report is we try to make a determination of how direct air capture costs will come down over time. So one of the important things to know is that direct air capture has received very little policy support and money from the federal government. But if you look at policy support for things like solar or wind or other energy technologies, policy support really drives deployment and drives costs down over time. And we think that given the levels of deployment we saw in our modeling, that that cost will likewise come down over time. So we did an analysis looking at learning rates across the board in different industries, including energy technologies and also things like chemicals manufacturing. And we took a range of all the way from the most conservative learning rate that we've seen to the most aggressive, so something for like what we see for solar PV. And we analyzed direct air capture using those learning rates. And what we think is that costs are going to come down to $50 to $150 per ton by mid-century, given the levels of deployment we're going to see. So that's it for this section of slides, and I'll turn it back to Jeff.
Thanks, Whitney. It's very interesting. Obviously, cost is the most important component of this. If costs were no issue here, we'd certainly see direct air capture popping up all over the place. I did have one quick question that came from the audience back on your slide 8, which I'll go back to. Sorry. What was the source for the point carbon capture and sequestration?
Sorry. What was the source for what?
Okay, well, we'll hold it for now and try and get it from the source. Okay, well, with that, we've been talking about cost a lot, and certainly the biggest component in cost is technology. So with that, let me turn it to Lori to talk a little bit about the technology.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Hi, everyone, and thanks for your time and for your business interest in direct air capture. I'll talk a little bit about the technology, and then as Jeff outlined, I'll talk about the emerging markets a bit later in the presentation. This slide gives you a high-level overview of our direct air capture technology. And in demystifying DAC, as Jeff noted, it's important to note that being able to do direct air capture is not new. We've actually known how to scrub CO2 out of the atmosphere for decades, and it's how we put humans in spacecraft and submarines. And moreover, while we're using some clever techniques in this diagram here, it's actually fairly simple chemistry, and I'll walk you through it. The problem, as Whitney noted, was that it costs more than $600 per ton to do it that way. So what is new and what carbon engineering has been working on for the last 10 years is the ability to do that CO2 capture at a very large scale and at very low cost. And to do that by design, all of the technologies that you see before you here in this block diagram are pieces of equipment that we've borrowed from other industries and that are available from multiple vendors. And the link that you can see at the bottom of that page would take you to that paper that Whitney mentioned that we published in Joule, where we provide a detailed techno-economic analysis showing how we get to a cost of $100 per ton. So some game-changing innovations and technology to get to that really low cost to remove the CO2. We actually started capturing atmospheric CO2 from our pilot plant back in British Columbia, back in 2015. So the Joule paper contains not just an analysis of the theory of putting these pieces of equipment together, but also the results and what we learned by implementing this solution in our pilot plant. As we follow through the diagram from left to right, keep your eye on the purple text, as that's where you'll find the carbon along the way as we move it through the process. So first up on the left is, as Jeff said, very, very dilute CO2 in the atmosphere, 0.04%. So we put the atmospheric air through an air contactor. This step, because it's so dilute, this step is a cost driver and it needs to concentrate the CO2 as much as possible. And so we do that by putting the air in contact with an aqueous potassium hydroxide solution that removes the majority of the CO2 from the ambient air as it passes through the system. We then put that solution, CO2-rich solution that you see in purple there, through a pellet reactor, and we precipitate out the CO2 from that aqueous solution in the form of calcium carbonate pellets. Through that step, we've bumped up the concentration of CO2 again, and we produce calcium carbonate pellets, which is very similar to just little seashells that you can hold in your hand. The next step is to take those pellets and release the CO2 from those pellets. So we put them into a calciner that you see there in the diagram as well, and we heat them up, and that releases the CO2 from the pellets. The other thing you can see in this diagram is that we've actually got two closed loops, and it's important to keeping those costs down that each of those steps along the way does some clever chemistry, and we actually regenerate the chemicals from the previous step so that we can take them back and essentially once the plant is built and seeded with the initial chemical fill, we have very little chemical makeup, and so those chemicals are put back to work in the previous step again to move some more CO2 through the process. The big question for us then, once we have that pure CO2 stream that you see on the right-hand side, is what do you do with the CO2? How can we put that CO2 to work so that we can get these direct air capture plants built? So what carbon engineering did, that in addition to looking at producing CO2 for direct use, we knew that low carbon fuel markets exist today. And so carbon engineering felt that it was important to go one further step to be able to address those low carbon fuel markets. And we built out our pilot plant as well. So next slide, please, Jeff. What we did was to address those near-term markets that value carbon, both CO2 and low carbon fuels, is that we also decided that we needed to implement the downstream use of that atmospheric CO2 to make low carbon fuels. What we've done, and I'll show you the technology that we use for that on the next slide, is then to be able to have two different types of plants, direct air capture plants that produce CO2 that can enable negative emissions through permanent geologic storage, and also the use of that atmospheric CO2 in a fuel synthesis step to produce drop-in compatible fuel for reducing emission in transportation fuels. Next step, please. Next slide, please. And there's a look at those, the process that we use for air to fuels and the building blocks. Again, just like the direct air capture plant, these building blocks are based on off-the-shelf technology. So on the left-hand side, we have electrolyzers that we use to produce renewable hydrogen, and Fischer-Tropsch systems to produce the fuel from the carbon and the hydrogen. The result of that process is a beautiful long-chain hydrocarbon, and you can see some of our synthetic diesel burning on the right in the photo alongside regular diesel, which is burning on the left. It's important to note that the value today in that synthetic fuel is in what you can't see, which is the ultra low carbon intensity of that fuel. But it's a nice byproduct of the process that, that this synthetic diesel also burns very cleanly. Next slide, please. So you might ask if it's possible to create hydrocarbons, liquid fuels from atmospheric CO2, why isn't anyone doing it today? So to round out the technology discussion, it's important to note that the economic viability of air to fuels, as we call it, benefits not only from the new development of direct air capture, but also from some of the changes that I've listed there on the left. So there have been advances in electrolyzers. There's a growing abundance of low-cost renewable power, for instance, from wind and solar. And the Fischer-Tropsch fuel synthesis process is proven out around the world. So when we put those four things together, that actually makes it viable and economic to make these low-carbon fuels. They have an ultra low carbon intensity. They're drop-in compatible, so we make a diesel or a jet fuel that's drop-in compatible with no blend wall. Of course, there's a liquid fuel system around the world that's easy to tap into, fully transportable, and with a high energy density. Another advantage that we have is that we have very low land and water use, and in fact, typically we're looking at locations that put our plants on non-arable land and co-locate with some of those renewable energy sources. And of course, it's highly scalable. With air as our primary feedstock, we can put these plants anywhere, and that we have the energy resources to be able to run them and the markets to be able to take the products. So we're really only limited practically by the demand for direct air capture. And that's it. Back over to you, Jeff.
Thank you, Lori. Very, very helpful. Let me ask a general question. When you look at the production of low carbon products and the concept of CO2 utilization, CO2 is really just an input, and therefore it's a cost. So I guess the broad question I would ask would be, why would direct air capture be the best source or even a good source given the higher cost compared with other sources of acquiring CO2?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and certainly we'll talk a bit more about enhanced oil recovery, but you see carbon products and enhanced oil recovery and other carbon uses using carbon dioxide today. So the question as to why would you use atmospheric CO2 versus those other sources of CO2, I guess there's a couple different answers. One is that there are lots of locations that need for CO2 that don't have access to CO2. So if we look at the Permian Basin, there's CO2 tapped into natural sources underground that are then piped down into the Permian Basin to support enhanced oil recovery, but you don't have those natural sources, those domes available in lots of other places around the world that need for the CO2. So the ability to capture CO2 from the atmosphere gives you that ready access to that resource. The other thing is that we have carbon policies today and more emerging all over the world that are putting a value on atmospheric CO2 and the permanent sequestration of that atmospheric CO2, as Whitney was outlining. So now we're starting to say, okay, that there's actually an inherent value in doing negative emissions, starting to pull some of that carbon out of the air, and we'll put a value on that through different carbon valuation policies, and that helps then to close the business case to make atmospheric CO2 economic for use in those carbon utilization scenarios.
Very interesting, and I'd like to put in a pitch, or at least a reference for a report that C2ES published about a month ago on carbon utilization. And in the course of preparing that report, we interviewed a number of CO2 utilization developers. And surprisingly, one of their biggest issues is always access to CO2 as raw material. Where do they get the CO2 from? In many cases, they pay for it from companies that sell it by the truckload, essentially. So I guess if I could sum up what you're saying, it has a lot to do with not just the specific cost of the acquisition of the CO2, but other issues like location, which affect the transportation of the CO2 and the availability of it. So in many cases, perhaps direct air capture does make sense as a source.
Exactly right.
Great. Before we move on, I do want to go back to Whitney and ask a couple of somewhat narrow questions about things you talked about. A question from the audience: when you looked at direct air capture costs, did you assume that separated CO2 would be in the form for pipeline transit? So in other words, if you can discuss what that means a little bit for us. CO2 can be in many forms. It can be gaseous, it can be liquefied. For transit, it is usually liquefied. Is that correct? And I believe that's the nature of the question of this person.
So the costs include, so the costs that are shown on the slide that is on slide, oh gosh, 9, I think it is. Those costs are just for the cost of removal, but it is for a pure stream of CO2, so greater than 99% pure. And then in order to compress and then transport the CO2, then it's usually an additional, I would say, in the range of $18 to $20 per ton. And that's a number that's attributable to NAS as well. So this is just for removal, but if you're wanting to reference it in terms of sequestered, that's the number we usually add.
Okay, thanks. One more along the same lines. Could you share the cost per ton of carbon reduction from solar compared to direct air capture?
So we don't have right now publicly available abatement numbers for solar. The reason for that is because solar electricity itself doesn't abate emissions in the same way that direct air capture does. So direct air capture is something that physically removes CO2, and then that CO2 can be stored in the ground. In the case of solar, that's a technology that then displaces something else that is presumably producing CO2, though not always. So solar can also displace other zero emissions technologies such as wind or nuclear. And so depending on the location of where solar is deployed, the abatement costs are very locationally dependent, depending on both the resource and then also what it's displaced. So because of that, we don't publish any kind of abatement numbers for solar because we don't really feel that it's representative to do just kind of an average.
Okay, thanks. Let me go to Lori on this one. Let's go to your slide 12 there. What is the most intensive part of this process? Is it the air and water? Is it the pellets? And while we're talking about the pellets, another audience member wants to know why release the CO2 from the pellets.
Sure. The hardest part of this whole process is that first step. We've got atmospheric CO2 very dilute, and we need to find a really cost-effective way to pull that CO2 out and begin to concentrate it and move it through the solution, move it through the process. So that's the hardest part, to get the economics right, and then the steps along the way then are moving the carbon through. In terms of why release the CO2 from those pellets, and we get that question quite a bit. So good question. And certainly you could just store then those calcium carbonate pellets, and you've removed a lot of atmospheric CO2. So that's essentially one sequestration step if you wanted to do that. The reason why we don't do that is that by design, we want to bring those chemicals back into the previous step so that we don't have to replace those chemicals in the plant, and we can just let the plant keep on running, moving the CO2 through the process. So we want to release the CO2, make it available for other uses, sequestration and utilization, and then take those chemicals back into the previous step so they can do some more work.
And while we're looking at this particular diagram again, how dependent are the economics of electricity sales on the right side of that diagram?
Absolutely big operating costs for the plant, and so the drop in pricing for renewable energy, low carbon energy, has had definitely an advantageous impact on the economics for our plant. In the joule paper, if you go there, you'll see that we produce a levelized cost of $100 per ton, but we used different input costs of assuming $30 or $60 per megawatt hour for that renewable energy. And of course, in the best locations in the world where we can put a plant, the prices are well below that now. So that just helps the overall economics.
So an issue that comes up quite a bit when you're talking about traditional carbon capture, especially on a power plant, is the issue of how much energy it actually takes to run carbon capture. And in the case of say a power plant, you may be talking about parasitic power of as much as a third of the total power. Now that's coming down quite a bit, but it's still an issue. So the question for our subject today is, how much energy roughly does it take to remove, let's say, a ton of CO2 from the atmosphere, or any way you can characterize it?
Yeah. So again, the joule paper would give any of the audience the details on the energy requirements, but just at a really high level, a direct air capture plant that pulls 1 million tons of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere per year uses about 100 megawatts. And so what we're looking at is actually the build out of new additional wind and solar resources to be able to support these plants. Of course, and William will talk a little bit about it, the first commercial plant in the Permian. But when we look to regions like that where there's a demand for CO2, there's also a lot of wind and solar resource that haven't yet been tapped into, in addition to the wind and solar resources that are there that we might make use of as well. So lots of renewable energy available, and we actually support the build out of new wind and solar projects to run our plants in the locations with the CO2 demand.
Great, thank you. And I'll just ask one more. What is the most likely energy input for this process? Now, you have some experience with this already, but so let's talk about the energy input currently for what you're operating, but as you see it going forward, would it be natural gas? Would it be renewables? Or would it be some combination?
Yeah, I guess each location that we look at, the answer can be different. And what we ultimately look to is, what do the policies that credit the removal of carbon, what do they require in terms of the clean energy inputs that we can use? And so typically and the overall carbon intensity of our entire process is measured in a life cycle analysis to determine how much good we've done and how many credits we get. So typical inputs are wind, solar, hydro, and nuclear that are allowed in that process. And up here in British Columbia, we have a hydro grid. So grid power counts as low carbon. The other thing I'll note, actually, since you've got it up on the slide, is that in our process today, we do use some natural gas into Oxy-Fire, the calciner, but we co-capture all of the CO2 from that combustion and provide it the output. So you'll see that stream of CO2 within a 1 ton of input of atmospheric CO2 can be anywhere between 1 and 1.5 tons of CO2. So once that CO2 gets sequestered, there is no net addition of CO2 from that combustion. It goes back down and gets sequestered as well, and we can then tune the process to make best use of the energy that's available, all the way from an all-electric system through to making use of natural gas in the process, and that'll depend on the economics of the price point for the renewable energy, wind, solar, hydro, nuclear as an input, and also the availability of natural gas.
Great, that's very helpful. Now we've talked a little bit about the technology and about the need for this, but we haven't yet gotten into what we promised, which is what's the business case and what this could mean for businesses in the U.S. So I'd like to go back to Whitney and ask her to discuss that a little bit.
Sure. So we have on our end been looking into what's kind of the case for corporate America for a direct air capture scale up. So I'm going to just go over a high level at a very basic what the industries are, and this is the primary industries associated with direct air capture. It's not necessarily, you know, companies that would buy low carbon fuels as Lori talked about, or things like that. So as I mentioned previously, most of our modeling shows that by mid-century we're going to need 1 to 2 gigatons of direct air capture capacity. And the way I like to think about that is that we're talking about scaling an industry that's roughly the size of the electric power industry in the United States today. So this is a huge industry, and there's obviously going to be a lot of other industries involved in supplying the direct air capture industry. So just simplistically, the way we think about it is that we have construction of the plant, and there again, and Lori or William are probably better suited to speak to this, but just so people have kind of a frame of reference in their minds, we think of a direct air capture plant being kind of the same size or same footprint as a natural gas combined cycle plant. So there's a lot of equipment that goes into these plants. There's a lot of construction materials, including cement and aggregate and steel. And then there's, of course, the labor component for the construction and engineering and design behind the plant itself. And labor is an important industry along the way, including the construction of the plant, the operation and maintenance, and the outputs from the plant. So for the operation and maintenance, or O&M, as Lori mentioned, there is a big chemical component to these plants. With their technology, those chemicals are potassium hydroxide and calcium carbonate primarily. For the other technology under direct air capture, which is a solid sorbent technology, it's a different material, still falls under the chemicals industry. And then there's the energy requirement for the plant. So the electricity that it takes to run the equipment, and then the large heating component, which can be supplied by natural gas, electricity, or nuclear. And then the primary outputs we consider with direct air capture, or we're going to consider in our analysis, are based on a plant that is going to directly sequester the CO2, depending on the configuration of that plant. So if it's an air to fuels plant like Lori was talking about, obviously it would have a different output, and that could involve different industries. So I think there's a lot of options here. This is kind of more of a simplistic way to characterize a plant that does direct air capture for sequestration. So pipelines is a big industry that's already existing, and the labor that goes into building and maintaining pipelines. And we expect there to be a lot more pipeline infrastructure for transporting and storing CO2. And then there's also the labor and materials that go into drilling these CO2 storage wells in order to get the CO2 sequestered. So that's kind of our framework in which we think about the industries that are directly involved with a direct air capture to sequestration plant. And then I think Lori and William will get a little bit more into the specifics in terms of companies that they've worked with and things like that. So I'll turn it back to you, Jeff.
Great, thanks again. Well, we do want to talk about the business potential for direct air capture. Lori, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, maybe we can go to the next slide and just take a look at some of those markets. So this slide's just trying to give you a sense of the different kinds of market opportunities that we're seeing, both through independent reports as well as customers that we're talking to about carbon dioxide and low carbon fuels. The early markets that we see are certainly an enhanced oil recovery, and William's going to talk a bit more about that. The world uses about 80 million tons per year of CO2, of which 50 million is used in enhanced oil recovery. So that's a big current existing demand. And now that some of those policies are in place that Whitney mentioned, it's now improving the economics if the CO2 is also sequestered in that process. In addition to EOR, we're also seeing customers come forward, and some companies are coming forward publicly saying that negative emissions are really important for environmental and other reasons, and they would like to include negative emissions in their overall sustainability plan in order to provide some environmental benefit. So that's fantastic. So I've got small scale sequestration there on the list because customers are coming forward and saying that they want to purchase negative emissions. And then of course, I talked a bit about the market. There's already a market for low carbon fuels. Over time, what we see happening is that larger scale sequestration, both because governments want to incentivize that, and as well as potentially we've certainly got some global governments talking about the fact that CO2 is a pollution in the air, and they would like to implement air treatment, just like we do water treatment, as an infrastructure. And then finally, there's a huge ecosystem for carbon utilization, and we see some of those markets becoming viable as well once the price point of the CO2 direct air capture has been brought down. Next slide, please. This one's just a quick look at that abatement cost diagram that Whitney mentioned earlier, and it's just a generic look. There are lots of studies that have been done to look at, what does it actually cost to eliminate emissions. And over on the left-hand side of the curve, what you see is that in some cases, for instance, in building efficiency efforts, you may actually not only eliminate emissions or avoid emissions, but also save some money. So we should do those, and lots of efforts underway worldwide to do that. In the middle there, in the light blue zone, there are other efforts like renewable energy and electrification that can achieve avoided or eliminated emissions at a lower cost, and those are underway. And then as you climb toward the right-hand side and work toward that net zero emissions, what you find is that costs start to increase. And so what we see, direct air capture is a new tool in the toolbox. And so as we get closer to net zero and we see those costs climbing, what direct air capture essentially does is put a cap on the cost of decarbonizing. You can use negative emissions to offset emissions from other hard to decarbonize industries and achieve that at a known price point. And per that cross-hatched area, it's much lower cost than some other efforts to decarbonize. Next slide, please. So in terms of the business potential, we have lots of different great independent studies of what's the size of those carbon markets going to look like. So you see some summaries here on the table. Certainly in the low carbon fuel, low carbon products, and then small scale CO2 negative emissions removal going to much larger scale over time. So we see the market certainly worth trillions of dollars by 2050 as the world decarbonizes. We were estimating that direct air capture will play a significant role, upwards of 20 gigatons in that whole decarbonization market. Last slide, and one more slide, please, Jeff. So just to summarize what that business opportunity looks like, trillions of dollars in that market. And I've included a link there to the Carbon Disclosure Project, which is interesting to look at in addition to all of the government policies that are emerging. We also have over 6,000 companies reporting into the Carbon Disclosure Project, talking about the risks that they see for their businesses, for instance, from stranded assets that will be underwater or other kinds of climate impacts, and also the climate-related business opportunities that they see, which are also echoing the size of these markets. The good news is that, as Whitney mentioned, carbon policies such as the 45Q tax credit and California's low carbon fuel standard are already in place today that make direct air capture projects economic. And we see more governments following California's lead, thinking about putting negative emissions into their policies as well. So expect it to broaden and deepen globally over time. Finally, direct air capture, new tool in the toolbox, gives you the potential to decarbonize otherwise hard to decarbonize sectors like aviation through the sequestration of that CO2, and the potential to avoid new emissions by just recycling the carbon out of the air into a low carbon fuel, and then new economic development through all of those projects. That's it for me. Back to you, Jeff.
Laura, I have a question for you. When people think of traditional carbon capture, they often think of the utility industry, and certainly that's the first application that comes to mind. In the direct air capture world, are there complementary business models that would involve the utility industry, if that makes sense? I think the intent of this question is instead of hooking a big big traditional capture unit up to a utility, is there a way of working with utility industries to bring direct air capture into the mix?
I guess certainly carbon capture from for instance, from a power plant is also being done today, is important to be doing as well. They lie on the abatement curve, and estimates are that they can do so also economically. So we should be doing that. You don't need to, because the atmosphere recirculates all the time. It's essentially 0.04% all around the globe. And so what we find, given that we are just using air as a feedstock, is that where you put those plants is where you can get the best renewable energy pricing, and you have a demand for that CO2. So we put a direct air capture plant, typically not co-located with those industries. We'll choose the best locations for those other reasons, both on the resource side and on the offtake side.
Jeff, I can add a little bit on this nexus with the utility industry in terms of how we've thought about it. One of the things that we've been thinking about is that we're starting to see a lot more utilities themselves announce things like net negative emissions goals by 2050. For example, Excel Energy and others have made goals in the past year or so. And so I think what you could potentially see is them using a technology like direct air capture, just like they use any of their other electricity generating technologies. In the modeling work we've done, we see that by 2050, in these scenarios that achieve these emissions goals, that there's so much renewables deployed that direct air capture is actually used kind of like a balancing resource in combination with other forms of energy storage. So I think that you could see direct air capture be just a technology in a utilities portfolio, just like any of the other energy technologies.
Great, thanks very much. We're talking about business opportunities, and I think it's time to bring in our third speaker, William Swetra from Oxy LowCarbon Ventures. I think the thing we hear most often, certainly when I talk about direct air capture on Capitol Hill or elsewhere, is that there's no business model here. And that there are breakthrough companies like Carbon Engineering, but how much does this really mean to the traditional business community? And I think William's going to give us a good sense of that. So with that, let me turn it over to William Swetra.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff, and thank you to C2S for pulling this webinar together. All of the participants, Lori with Carbon Engineering, the Rhodium group for sharing their knowledge and expertise on direct air capture. I'm William Swetra, an analyst with Oxy LowCarbon Ventures, and I'm excited to speak to you today about Oxy's investment in carbon engineering and more broadly discuss Occidental's strategy to transition to a low carbon economy and how carbon capture, utilization, and storage fit into those plans and the role we see for direct air capture. Before jumping in, I think it's appropriate to do a quick introduction to Occidental. We're an international oil and gas exploration and production company celebrating our 100-year anniversary next year with over 3 decades of operational experience in the Middle East, in Oman, Qatar, and the UAE, and Colombia and South America. The recent acquisition of Anadarko increases our domestic footprint with operations in Wyoming, where we're one of the largest private landowners and taxpayers in the state, Colorado and the DJ Basin, offshore Gulf of Mexico, and the Permian Basin in West Texas and southeastern New Mexico. We also have a large chemical subsidiary in OxyChem, who produces PVC, caustic soda, chlorine, and other basic chemicals, and we're first or second in the U.S. in these markets. Next slide, Jeff. So Occidental is taking a leadership role to usher in an economy-wide deployment of carbon capture, utilization, and storage technologies, with direct air capture being a pivotal component of our long-term strategy. We worked with a variety of stakeholders in Washington, including the Carbon Capture Coalition, and I'm sure many folks on this webinar to support passage of 45Q. And we really continue to advocate for CCUS legislation, such as the Use It Act, to advance legislative support for CCUS research, development, and deployment, and really to formalize our efforts in pursuit of low carbon energy solutions and create the business case for CCUS. We formed Oxy LowCarbon Ventures, and as Jeff mentioned, a wholly owned subsidiary dedicated to pursuing low carbon business solutions with a dual objective: to enhance profitability and sustainability of our businesses while meeting the challenge of reducing atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations. We're working to reduce our total carbon impact by leveraging our CO2 enhanced oil recovery position and subsurface knowledge to geologically store CO2 in our EOR basins, saline aquifers, and use CO2 as a feedstock for product creation. Also, which may come as a surprise, through development and investment in renewable energy projects, Occidental actually just unveiled our first solar facility, 16 megawatts with 174 PV panels, just 2 weeks ago in the Permian Basin outside Odessa, which at full capacity can power the adjacent oil field. Investment in CCUS projects and infrastructure like White Energy. White Energy is a biofuel producer in the panhandle of Texas, where we'll capture CO2 off the fermentation process for use in enhanced oil recovery operations in the Permian. This was the first project announcement after 45Q was passed in the Bipartisan Budget Act. Additionally, we aim to help others reduce their emissions through our CCUS Technical Advisory Service Team, and of course, our investment in carbon engineering falls under the Low Carbon Ventures umbrella. Next slide, Jeff. Next slide, please, Jeff. Jeff?
William, I've advanced them. I'm the one I'm looking at says carbon neutral energy cycle. And the one before that was carbon engineering.
Yeah, could you go back to the carbon engineering slide? I'm sorry, didn't update on my end.
Yes, that's what I'm on right now. You see
Perfect,
it?
thanks so much. So
Yeah.
in January 19, Oxy made an equity investment in carbon engineering with the goal to commercialize the technology and build the first plant. Pre-feed was announced in May, began in July, and recently in September, we increased the capacity design of the first commercial scale plant from 500,000 tons to 1 million tons in the Permian Basin. This was due to interest from companies from various industries looking to decarbonize that did not have point sources of emissions. We, like many leading institutions, view carbon removal technology such as direct air capture as vital to mid-century decarbonization goals and really key to Oxy's carbon neutrality ambitions. Captured CO2 will be used for enhanced oil recovery, saline storage, creation of low carbon products such as tires, carbon fibers, CO2 to useful chemicals, and long-term durable plastics, and as a feedstock for low carbon fuel production, and a host of other products that have the potential to displace their more carbon intense counterparts. And really, chemists are just starting to explore the potential for using captured CO2. And I just want to point everyone to a recent IEA report entitled Putting Carbon to Use as a really great reference if you want to understand this space a little bit more. As noted by Lori and others, the direct air capture qualifies for the low carbon fuel standard under the CCUS protocol. And Oxy has been working in tandem with the California Air Resources Board to submit our first project application. And as been noted, DAC benefits from this program and is not location dependent to qualify. Next slide, Jeff, please.
Okay, you're advanced.
I'm advanced, thank you. So in our 2019 climate report, which is publicly available, Occidental announced our ambitions to become a carbon neutral organization. We aim to sequester more CO2 in our reservoirs, which have shown a great appetite for CO2 than is used in the process and combustion of our product. To date, Occidental has injected more than 400 million tons of CO2 in our reservoirs and have 40 years of experience safely transporting and injecting CO2. We operate roughly 2,500 miles of CO2 pipeline, employ 34 enhanced oil recovery floods with the potential for many more in our inventory. We also have 14 CO2 recycling recompression facilities in the Permian Basin that recompress the CO2 at high pressure that comes up with the produced fluids after it's separated by surface equipment, creating a closed loop system so that more than 99.9% of supplied CO2 that's injected ultimately comes permanently trapped in the reservoir. We also comply with Subpart RR of EPA's greenhouse gas reporting program, which verifies safe and permanent storage of CO2 in our enhanced oil recovery operations, and is vital to accessing the 45Q tax credit. And Oxy worked really in lockstep with the EPA to develop those first two monitoring and reporting verification plans, one's at our Denver unit, another at our Hobbs field in New Mexico. And these plans really lay out in detail the geology of our fields that simulate CO2 plume migration, well remediation and emergency response plans, among a host of other data points, really ought to ensure that we're being safe and a prudent operator as possible. And again, both these plans are publicly available on EPA's website. But really key to achieving this ambition of carbon neutrality that Oxy has spoken about several times over the last year is pulling more anthropogenic CO2 into our network, and starting with a negative emission source like direct air capture is really vital for achieving our carbon reduction goals. Next slide, please, Jeff.
Hey, William, before we move on, this is always an issue that raises some controversy, to be honest about it, and that's the issue of enhanced oil recovery. And someone asked the question very simply, doesn't using captured CO2 for EOR defeat the purpose? Now, I'm going to let you handle that, but I do want to say, in terms of C2ES's view of that, we believe that carbon capture in all of its forms is always a net benefit to the climate, and we wouldn't be involved in it if it weren't a climate tool. But I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's a great point, and I know that there are people out there who view EOR in a different light than Occidental does. But our long experience handling CO2, and we have a lot of reservoir information. We really know them well, and just from a technical standpoint, we know that we can actually sequester more CO2 in our reservoir than is used in the process and combustion of the product. And ultimately, we view that as a pathway to creating really low carbon, carbon neutral, or even carbon negative fuels into the future. So, we're still going to be using oil for the foreseeable future. And our CEO has said many times that she hopes the last barrel produced and consumed on this planet is a CO2 EOR barrel when using anthropogenic CO2. And these are studies from the IEA that have shown that it's a less carbon intense barrel than a conventionally produced barrel.
Thanks, William. I'd add to that, the Clean Air Task Force estimates that a barrel of oil produced through EOR is, I believe the number is 64% as carbon intensive as a barrel produced from a new well. So that's one issue. The other issue I'd mention is land use, which is always an important issue. And obviously it's probably better to be pumping from an existing field than it is to be exploring new fields in terms of land use. So those are just C2ES thoughts on the environmental issues surrounding EOR. But with that, let you get back to your presentation, and we'll move to the next slide.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, Jeff, I completely agree with you there. And there are benefits from not having to go and explore new fields and drill new wells. But really, what I wanted to leave everyone with was really an exciting commercial opportunity incorporating direct air capture, into a larger vision. So, as noted, direct air capture requires, consistent, non-intermittent, carbon-free power. And Oxy's working on this concept that we call the Green Campus or Clean Campus in the Permian Basin. We're proposing, by synergistically combining direct air capture with net power, dispatchable oxy-combustion, natural gas-fired electric generation technology, that's a mouthful, that captures all of its emissions, with enhanced oil recovery, data centers, fuel synthesis, and plastics manufacturing, to create a closed-loop system where all CO2 can be captured and sequestered while still ensuring an adequate supply of energy to support industrial growth. And overall, our real interest here, is to gain operational experience by helping develop the first commercial scale DAC facility, which will enable us really to take those learnings and deploy a host more before the end of this 45Q deadline at the end of 2023. And back to you, Jeff.
Great, thanks very much, William. Very much appreciate it. We were talking a little bit about the environmental aspects of this, and someone did raise the life cycle question earlier, and it was with regard to carbon engineering. So, Lori, get ready for a question. The question was, has carbon engineering done a full life cycle analysis of its air-to-fuel products for diesel or jet fuel?
Thanks, Jeff. Yes, absolutely. As the audience will know, the overall crediting of low carbon fuel is based upon the life cycle analysis and the final carbon intensity of that fuel. And so we've done a number of life cycle analysis for different products. When we use natural gas in our process, the overall carbon intensity of that fuel product is about 30 grams per megajoule. And when we use all low carbon electricity, we end up with about 10 grams per megajoule. So very low, ultra low carbon fuels, depending on how we use the inputs. And then for us, as I mentioned earlier, the trade-off is what's the availability of the different kinds of energy inputs into our system? What's the most cost effective, given that a low carbon fuel that has 10 grams per megajoule will be more valuable in that fuel market than one that has 30 grams per megajoule, but the costs may be higher or lower. So we look to optimize based on the available energy inputs and the demand to try to optimize the economics for that air to fuels plant.
Thanks. Let's talk a little bit about investment again. We haven't talked much about 45Q yet, and I do want to get to that. But Lori, your steel in the ground really comes before 45Q. Is that right? I mean, well, you couldn't have taken the tax credit. So the question would be how you came up with private investment for what you're doing. And I guess my follow-on question will be, will 45Q make it easier going forward for projects like yours?
Yeah, so certainly if you ask some of our early investors, and for instance, Bill Gates was one of our early investors, and he's planted lots of seeds for new kinds of technologies that have the potential to make a meaningful impact on climate change. So I guess I would say in the early days, the sort of basic chemistry, technical viability of doing this was understood, but could we get to a cost point that would make us able to go to commercial scale was the question. And so we had early seed investors that were willing to take that risk for the potential of really working through the technology and coming out with a direct air capture solution that would be meaningful at scale. So that was the nature of our early investors. When we look at the business potential now that we're commercializing and going forward with the first commercial scale plant, the beneficial impact of 45Q is enormous. The projects as it stands today must begin construction before January 1st, 2024. So it's important, of course, that we're out ahead of that target, which we will be with the first plant that William mentioned. But that's great. It's a strong policy, and in fact, between 45Q and California's low carbon fuel standard credit for negative emission, the U.S. is the best place for us to go for the first commercial plants. And then we're seeing, as I mentioned earlier, other carbon policies around the world and across the U.S. also looking to include negative emissions. And so we anticipate building both direct air capture and air-to-fuels plants across the globe.
So I guess we can assume that Bill Gates really wouldn't need the tax credit to get involved in this kind of venture, but going forward, others might.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, and yeah, we certainly have investors who need the tax credits and tax equity investors that are looking at direct air capture plants as well.
And William, I've got to bring you in on this because Oxy has been a big supporter of the notion of the 45Q tax credit, not just for your own bottom line, but I think for development across the board of all technologies related to carbon capture. But if you want to say anything about that.
Just briefly, Jeff, I mean, of course, 45Q is the world-leading policy, and Oxy works really hard with a bunch of stakeholders to try to get that across the finish line, and we see it applicable when we look at the low-hanging fruit of ethanol or ammonia or natural gas processing, and as Lori mentioned, the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, and then the RGGI states now are looking at a Transportation Climate Initiative where they're looking to develop their own form of the LCFS. So the economic incentives through policy are there. And we're looking forward to moving forward with this first project here in the Permian Basin and getting it
going. Someone raised the question, 45Q, have you looked at the benefits of sequestering the CO2 versus utilization? For those that don't know 45Q, the tax credit for using CO2 for EOR ramps up to $35 a ton. For sequestering it in geologic storage, it ramps up to $50 a ton. So I think this question is with regards to other types of utilization, non-EOR utilization versus sequester. So it's not really a 45Q question, but Laura, I guess back to you on this. I presume most of your most of your CO2 is going to utilization now, not sequester. Is that right?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and we are actually actively working with customers on both types of interests. Of course, we need to be responsive to what the market's demanding, and we're seeing both of those today. Demand for CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, but also demand from customers for just pure sequestration. The two different levels of 45Q at $35 and $50 a ton get factored into the economics as we look at the viability of each of those types of projects. But both of those kinds of projects are viable today, and we have customers interested in both.
And Jeff, if I may just jump in here, I think it's really important to understand that enhanced oil recovery is really the first commercially viable sink and commercial opportunity that's going to pay for that CO2 and be able to help pull it down the cost curve so that other industries can get involved and then pay for that CO2, and you'll start to see that utilization market grow. But EOR is currently the biggest demand for CO2 and is going to really help pull down the cost of capture.
And maybe I'll just echo something that William mentioned earlier about the amount of CO2 that gets ultimately trapped in the reservoir, even through EOR. Even though it's the lower tax credit that gets implemented for EOR, the credit goes for the amount of anthropogenic CO2 that has been sequestered. And so what's really important is that it's possible to keep, William mentioned 99.9% of the supplied CO2 becoming trapped in the reservoir. So that's important to us as well as we look at the overall economics, even though with an EOR project, it's the lower tax credit that's given.
While we're on the issue of 45Q, I mentioned what the levels of the tax credit were. There isn't a separate level for direct air capture, and some have suggested that may be one way to ramp up direct air capture quicker. I'll pick a number. This is not out of any report, but some suggested, for instance, $100 per ton captured through direct air capture would encourage more deployment. Does anyone have any thoughts about that? Again, not that precise amount necessarily, but the notion of trying to drive it through the tax code.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in. I would say absolutely at a higher credit level, that will absolutely accelerate the deployment of direct air capture.
And Jeff, I'll just add, and while I echo Lori's statement there, I think that what's really important here, and I think that if you open this up, that people would have a lot of different suggestions for a way to work with this new 45Q, possibly extending the commenced construction window, et cetera. But what I think is ultimately important is proving that 45Q enabled CCUS projects to go forward. So in the future, if we're looking to extend 45Q, there's actually real steel in the ground and projects to point to that the incentive has actually been doing what it was meant to do, which is incentivize CCUS deployment and build out in the United States.
Yeah, and I want to echo the issue that William just raised. There are a couple of issues in the current 45Q law, which was only passed last year, and you may be wondering why some would say let's amend it already. But one of those is that construction on a new project must commence by January 1st, 2024. That's what William mentioned. That's going to make it pretty difficult to get financing as time goes by. The IRS has not yet issued its regulations to implement the 45Q tax credit, so we will have lost almost 2 years since the enactment. So many people, including the Carbon Capture Coalition, have suggested that simply extending that the begin construction deadline of 2024, and also extending the credit beyond the current cutoff of 2030 would be good for deployment, and certainly good for direct air capture, which is somewhat in its infancy and probably needs longer to develop. Let me move to another issue, if we could. We've only got about 10 minutes left, but I do want to touch on the issue of research and development, because we haven't really mentioned that much, and really that's one of the most central issues here. We always say that research and development and cost are very closely tied. In fact, the Department of Energy, their entire carbon capture program is based on reducing the cost of capture. So I want to throw this out generally to our speakers, how they view R&D issues. What level of R&D should the federal government be aiming for, and how can we most quickly ramp up R&D to bring the costs down by 2050? You're tapping pretty hard. Seriously.
Jeff, I'll take a stab at that here initially. While I don't have a direct number in mind, I do think it's important that we do continue to work with DOE and legislators to get more funding for direct air capture research and development. And just off the top of my head, the Use It Act and the Effect Act are two bills that speak to this and will provide funding mechanisms for direct air capture that are currently being discussed in the legislature.
Yeah, and Jeff, I'll mention as well, I mean, Whitney mentioned that there are 3 companies around the world with commercial ready technology today, but there should be many more. And I think as we counted up recently, there were fewer than 200 people working directly on direct air capture technologies around the world, and we need many, many more. So we absolutely support more research and development in this area, and there will be new innovations that come over time. We continue to innovate on our own technology to bring costs down and efficiencies up. And we absolutely support additional additional funds being spent allocated to R&D and additional companies and universities and research institutions becoming more involved in direct air capture. Given the importance of negative emissions, we certainly think that there should be more research and development happening around the world and in the U.S.
Just a figure to keep in mind, only about $11 million has been spent cumulatively by the federal government on R&D for direct air capture. The study that came out last year from the National Academy of Sciences suggested ramping up to a level of about $240 or $250 million per year. Now, that's not an annualized level. That would be a peak level over about a 15-year period. So I wonder if you all have any thoughts about that. But the plan they presented would roughly spend more than $1 billion on direct air capture R&D over roughly a 15-year period.
So I can speak to this a little bit. In our report, we get into this a little bit about how much is recommended from NAS, which you're right is $240 million per year, and I think the Energy Futures Initiative has done a little deeper dive into how that money should be used. But we've compared their recommendations to historical levels spent on other programs in DOE on RD&D, things like energy efficiency, renewable energy, the fossil energy program, the nuclear energy program. And $240 million is still about a quarter to a third of what those other programs receive. Likewise, it's a very small amount cumulatively over the 10 to 15 year period compared to the other programs.
Any other thoughts about R&D? We've got about 5 minutes left, and I do want to get to some broad-based questions to wrap up, but this is a very important one. So any last thoughts on R&D?
I mean, I think I'll just say I think we need R&D for direct air capture, just like we need it for all other technologies that are going to help us decarbonize the U.S. energy system. So I think that, yeah, it's a critical component. I think there's a lot we can learn from traditional carbon capture and the R&D program there. I think there's a lot of synergies, and it's definitely something I think the technology and the industry needs.
Great. I want to go back to the connection with renewables. So someone asked the question: can these plants be ramped up and down based on the availability of renewables, or do they need baseload power to operate? That's a very, very good question, because again, it's back to the connection to the utility industry.
Yeah. So the answer is that both are possible. Certainly, there are parts of our plant that would like to run 24/7, and there are parts of the plant, for instance, the electrolyzers, when we're making low carbon fuels, that can ramp with the availability of renewable energy. What we're seeing over time is that the grids in many locations are becoming cleaner, so that helps. There are solutions to put, for instance, wind and solar together, which increase the capacity factor, and then use some battery as well. And again, we look ultimately to the policies and what they will allow. And in some cases, the policies allow for a blend of power purchase agreements from renewables to cover our average needs. So each sort of plant instance that we look at uses the sort of the optimized blend of all of those things to put together to make the plant economics best.
Great. I've got time for one last question, which I'll ask. Comes from an old colleague of ours. Can the panelists talk about the relative size of the U.S. market versus the global market? And I think you know, it's the how quickly the opportunities would develop, because I think the long-term size of the markets are what they are, but near term is really the question.
I can take this one if Lori and William don't have anything to add. So I think that in terms of the long-term market, obviously Lori had this on her slides, and I think this comes roughly out of what is needed to achieve a 1.5 or 2 degree scenario, which is that globally we need about 10 to 20 gigatons of carbon dioxide removal by mid-century. Then our analysis has shown that in the US, we need about 1 to 2 gigatons of carbon dioxide removal. So it's about 10% of that global number. In the near term, I can't really speak to the individual markets, except for to say I think that the US has the largest market for EOR, which is the largest market for CO2 currently. So I think just at a high level, the US definitely has the largest market for CO2 when you're considering all the different uses of that. So I think it's really important here, and the way that we think about it is that the deployment of direct air capture for any use in the near term, whether it be EOR or to supply CO2 to beverage manufacturing, or CO2 for air to fuels, or any use is going to deploy the technology and therefore bring costs down to really where we need them to be by mid-century to scale up this technology.
That's great. Well, I'm afraid we'll have to hold it there. My summing up what we've learned is that there's a lot to be excited about here. The costs really are coming down, and the costs do appear to be more knowable. In other words, the range is not as wide as it once was, but R&D is critical, and certainly keep pushing on policies that will help enable direct air capture, such as 45Q. I want to thank our speakers again for the time they've taken, and thank the audience as well. Again, this will be posted on our website within a couple of days. And that's all we have for today. So signing off from C2ES. Thank you to everyone who's participated.